Welcome back to the final part of today's lecture. After having looked at some very fundamental criticisms of and issues with social psychological research, in this part I'm going to focus on a more practical question, on the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, and on the importance that relationship has for a lot of the research we're interested in. And I'm doing that because we're studying attitudes so frequently in social psychology. We study attitudes towards behaviors. So how do we feel about discrimination, about bystander intervention? We study attitudes about social groups, all studies around prejudice and intergroup bias, and also about substantive issues. How do you feel about climate change? So attitudes are really at the core of a lot of the research. So what are they? This is one of the clearest definitions, stating that they're relatively enduring evaluations of some object. Well, what does that mean? They're quite stable, and evaluation implies that they have some clear valence. Do we like the object? Do we not like the object? And we can have them towards all kinds of objects and ideas, towards brushing our teeth as much as towards eating ice cream. And clearly their content might be different in those two situations, where the idea of cognitive versus affective evaluation comes in. So I might feel a lot more emotionally attached to the idea of eating ice cream than to the idea of brushing my teeth, while cognitively I might feel more committed to brushing my teeth than to eating ice cream. Both types of evaluation are relevant to what I'm talking about here, so I don't need to make much of a distinction. But when you read about attitudes, it makes sense to ask which of those two levels people are talking about. Linking back to the difference between prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes, basically suggesting that both prejudice and stereotypes can be seen as types of attitudes here. How might we study them? The most obvious and probably most frequent idea is to ask people about their attitudes. How do you feel about people who are overweight? An alternative might be to use observations. And there are many reasons for sometimes preferring observations to self-reports, because self-reports can be influenced by issues of desirability. For one, social desirability. I don't really want to say things that are socially stigmatized. If I believe that expressing prejudice is wrong, that might shape how I respond to items that I believe measure prejudice. And there's self-deception. There are certain things that are true about myself that I might not like recognizing and speaking out. And the third question is around this measuring versus creating. If I ask you, how do you feel about guavas? You might not have a strong opinion about that before I ask you the question. So I might be said to be inducing the creation of an attitude rather than measuring something that's there. If I just observe behaviors, I get around some of those issues. And there are many ways to do that. So there's some research that measures facial expressions as an indication of attitudes, and that measures skin conductivity, so how much you sweat, as a measure of arousal, and again, as a proxy for attitudes. We can sometimes look at brain responses directly, though they can be very difficult to interpret. And we can also look at people's choices. That's what economists really prefer, because they say revealed preferences. Do you choose a guava in the cafeteria? Tell us a lot more about your real attitudes than reported preferences. And sometimes we can do that. Sometimes we can see at who actually ends up together in relationships. at who people put highly on the list of preferred roommates in universities that require you to submit such a list. So we can look at actual choices and then say, well, do these choices reveal something about underlying attitudes and preferences? The next question might be how attitudes come about. And that goes back to the discussion about prejudice comes about as a special case of attitude. So there might be personal experiences that are about associations between certain objects and certain outcomes. Personally, it might have been why guavas came to mind just now, at a really bad episode of food poisoning linked to eating guavas. The guavas weren't causing it, but for years I had this conditioned response, this link between the fruit and very negative outcomes. So negative attitudes from personal experience. But of course, it's not always so clear what the object is that we might be concerned about. So that's where social cognition comes in. Many people have worries about the weather changing because that they believe that weather changes lead to pains in their joints, for example. And there isn't very much medical evidence for those links. And at least some people argue that it's about social cognition, that it's about learning from each other, that that's an attribution for an experience, and therefore something to develop an attitude towards. So in that sense, attitudes depend a lot on how we explain events and behaviors to ourselves and to others. Social learning matters because that's how we learn most things in interactions with others. And things like the media and social media, of course, play their part, as do groups that we are in. And finally, there's some interesting research into genetic foundations for attitudes. And using fairly robust research designs, Bourgeois here found some surprisingly strong associations between genes and attitudes for some types of attitudes, and likely those related to quite fundamental personality traits. So some attitudes that might be said to be linked to very emotional, instinctive reactions, like reactions to abortion or the death penalty, are shown to be quite strongly related to your genetic makeup. And things like sensation seeking, the attitude towards roller coaster rides fall into this category as well. If you're interested in the influence of genes on social behavior, that's a paper to look up and read. Some attitudes are very clear and have a clear evolutionary basis. So seeing a lion, unless you're in a safari vehicle, is something that should be threat-inducing, should be triggering a negative attitude, while at least historically seeing a juicy antelope should trigger the opposite reaction. In those cases, we would expect those attitudes to predict behaviors, to run away from the lion, to go and hunt the antelope. But that relationship isn't straightforward. So while attitudes are this evolutionary shortcut to decision making, the relationship often isn't very strong. There are often various factors that might lead to a breakdown of the relationship between attitudes and behaviors. So one large meta-analysis here found an average correlation between attitudes and behaviors of about 0.5, which translates into 25% of variations in behavior being explained by variations in attitudes. That means, in the case of studying prejudice and discrimination, on average, I might expect to explain a quarter in different levels of discrimination by reference to prejudicial attitudes. So 3/4 would be left unexplained. And in that study, they looked at quite specific attitudes and found high variability. So sometimes they were very predictive, sometimes they weren't. An earlier study that looked more broadly at attitudes found a much lower correlation. So there's definitely quite a lot going on in explaining behavior apart from people's attitudes. But when are they linked? When do we observe a high level of correlation? And what's the direction? Do attitudes only predict behavior, or does the other direction also play a role? So firstly, about attitudes predicting behavior, we can sometimes observe quite a close relationship. That tends to be when attitudes are very specific. So not how do you feel about nature, but how do you feel about recycling? And when those attitudes are accessible through either direct experiences of recycling bins or frequent discussions about recycling. And the longer your attitude is stable, the more likely is it to influence behavior. Possibly due to cognitive dissonance. If you have a deeply held attitude, engage in behavior that contradicts that attitude, that behavior will be somewhat unpleasant. And lastly, it's about attitudes being salient in the situation. When you look at waste bins in various places, there are often signs that try quite strongly to turn that situation from a mindless behavior into something where your attitudes are salient. Do you like a clean environment? Do you like litter on the floor? Presumably not, if you think about it, as an evaluation of those situations. So in those cases, when you have a really specific attitude that's triggered in the situation, that is accessible and stable, we have a strong attitude-behavior relationship. In other cases, when those criteria are not met, the relationship might be very weak. And while we usually see attitudes as predicting behaviors, there are some suggestions that the relationship might actually go the other way around. So this rather old quote by Disraeli suggested that thought comes from action, that our behavior shapes how we then come to think about things, the attitudes that we come to hold. Why would that be? And for one, because quite often roles that we are in, social roles, shape first our behavior and then come to shape our identity. So while I said before that I don't put too much store into the Stanford prison experiment, certainly the basic idea of getting people to commit to playing the role of prison guards will influence their behavior, which in turn will influence their attitudes. A much more positive example comes from one of my favorite movies, from Paris 10, which I'd encourage you to watch. And one of the small stories in there is of a man who decided to act like a man in love again in a relationship that was going downhill. And in that story, through taking these repeated actions, he became a man in love again. And I'm sure that that resonates with you if you think about other stories, how sometimes engaging in a behavior repeatedly leads to a shift in attitudes. And apart from engaging in these social roles and coming to internalize them, there are some other theories that explain that link from behavior to attitudes. Self-perception, self-presentation, and cognitive dissonance are the three I'm going to be talking about briefly. So starting from self-perception, it's important to realize that often we really don't know what our attitudes at a particular moment are. And if we don't know, we can quite often find out by observing what we do. So when our feelings are quite weak or confused, we might observe our physiological responses, our arousal, but also very basically just what we do. And from that, you get some of the fairly widely reported findings that smiling can lead to happiness. Interestingly, even if it's not on your own face, so if it's not triggering a physiological response, but when it's on the face of an avatar that you identify with in a game. So there seems to be something very cognitive going on here as well. However, that only works when the behavior is chosen freely, when we can believe that the behavior gives us meaningful information about our attitude. It doesn't work if you're told to smile to be happier. So one of these things that is an interesting lab finding where it's not entirely obvious how to apply it to the real world, and where the obvious application to tell people to smile more might not be particularly helpful. So self-perception. We learn about our attitudes by observing what we do. Self-presentation is about wanting to appear, to act in congruence with social norms and with values that we hold dear. And for that to drive our behavior. And then again, to use that behavior to learn about our attitudes. So quite often, in a situation that first induces conformity might lead to attitudes that support the behavior to become internalized. So Theis has this nice image of the looking glass self becoming a magnifying glass. So really becoming a source of insight, or perceived insight into ourselves. And that's related to the last aspect, the cognitive dissonance, which we so far discussed as an inconsistency between two thoughts. I value equality and I have certain prejudicial beliefs. I value truthfulness, but I also like astrology. So thoughts that are in conflict. But there can also be a conflict between a thought and a behavior, an attitude and a behavior. And cognitive dissonance is always uncomfortable because we like consistency. So one line of experiments that shows that quite powerfully is that inducing people to tell small lies can get them to change their beliefs, to make those lies become true retrospectively. So if there's a very tedious experiment, and you get people to lie about how much they enjoyed it to the next participant, then they might remember, at least, the experiments, might change their attitude towards the experiment in a way that matches what they said. And again, that doesn't work when it's obvious why they lied. So if you tell them, I give you £10 now, if you go out and tell the next participant how great it was. But if there's no such motivation, then you can observe how attitudes are changed to match the behavior. Another area where that happens is where attitudes about probability are changed after you have made your choice. So when you cast a vote in an election, there's always this element of probability. Am I making the right choice? Is this candidate actually better than the other? When you ask people when they go into the polling booth, they're often quite willing to say, I think he's likely the better candidate. But I'm not quite sure. When you ask them afterwards, there's a lot more certainty. So the attitude matches the behavior. In the same way around betting on a horse, where once people place the bet, they are a lot more confident that that horse is going to win than just half a minute before they committed to the behavior. Clearly, attitudes can change over time. And based on what we just discussed around the link from behavior to attitudes, behavior change might be a precursor to attitude change. So in thinking about anti-prejudice interventions, for example, one aspect might be to look at behavioral change. Especially if only attitudes are targeted, you can sometimes just widen the attitude-behavior gap and give more influence to situational influences and other things that explain why attitudes don't translate into behaviors. For example, there was a study into recycling behavior where just talking about it only led to students intending to recycle a lot more than they actually recycled. Sometimes the gap between attitudes and behaviors is really striking and requires us to come up with some explanations. So the first very famous article was written by Lapierre in 1934, just called Attitudes versus Actions. It was based on quite a clever research design where Lapierre spent a long time traveling through the US with a Chinese couple, just visiting hotels and restaurants and observing the reactions that they got. And he reports that they sometimes got strange looks because it was a time of very high anti-Chinese prejudice in the US. But they were turned away only once. And afterwards, he surveyed those hotels and restaurants and asked, would you accept Chinese customers? And almost all of them said, no, we wouldn't. We would turn them away. It wasn't because that couple had been particularly unpleasant. You know, they had a control group of hotels and restaurants they didn't visit. They gave the same response. So, why would that be? Why would we see such a strong discrepancy between reported attitudes and behavior? Certainly one explanation could be social desirability in reverse. Today we usually think about it as a reason not to express prejudice. Maybe back then they thought the expected response was to say we would never serve Chinese customers, so they gave that response. But maybe, which is what my favorite explanation would be, is that they're conflicting norms. There's a norm shared by the role of citizen, so kind of by everyone, to dislike Chinese, and that's the norm that comes up when you open a letter, you sit in your office. And then there's a norm to treat your customers nicely, to not offend individuals. And that norm is triggered when you're actually in front of the restaurant greeting your customers. So these situational norms might, in this case, determine which attitude comes to be enacted. And this is one of the examples for a huge gap that highlights that we should look at both attitudes and behaviors and not just ask people about attitudes and conclude how much discrimination in this case there would be. So how do we think systematically about the link between attitudes and behavior? So the first contribution to that link comes from attitudes. So we have beliefs about the behavior, we have beliefs about potential outcomes, those form an attitude that influences whether or not we want to do something. But importantly, social norms come into it as well. So in this older theory of reasoned action, the idea was we have attitudes and norms, together they shape our intention, and that intention shapes behavior. The more modern theory of planned behavior says, well, that's right, but we also need to consider one additional level. And that additional level is about our beliefs of control in that situation. So reasoned action, attitudes plus norms might give us a desire, but then we also need to believe that we can actually engage in the behavior, and that influences both the intention and the link from intention to action. And there's lots of research into these different theories. One more modern extension is to say, well, moral norms are actually different from attitudes and the subjective norms. So there's also a place for them in theory. One final reason why it's important not to just study attitudes is because it can be quite hard to predict aggregate behaviors. Thomas Schelling, a Nobel Prize-winning sociologist, wrote this actually quite readable book on micromotives and macro behavior. And that he argued that if we only ask individuals about their motives, quite often our predictions about social outcomes will be wrong. The most famous example for that in Schelling's work is about neighborhood segregation, where he showed mathematically that if people hold fairly inclusive preferences, still hold some bias, but not a huge level of bias, you can still get to high levels of segregation. So in this example, these squares and triangles are a bit shapeist, so they don't want to live in a neighborhood where more than 2/3 of neighbors are from the other group. What we expect that to lead to a huge level of segregation, where we say it's really bad if people want to live with at least 1/3 of in-group members. Not sure, my intuition would have been that that leads to like not a huge level of segregation, but when you model this, you actually see that for everyone to be happy, you need very strong segregation. So it's one of the examples where relatively small bias can lead to an aggregate outcome that's a lot worse. The two images I just showed you come from a web page called The Parable of the Polygons that goes through this idea step by step and lets you play around with it through simple computer simulations. So agent-based modeling as a research method is about developing simple ideas for individual agents that of course are meant to represent people on some level, and then looking at the outcomes the system arrives at once everyone has acted in accordance to the simple rules. And it's gaining popularity in psychology because it's quite a good way to test whether some explanations actually work, whether our explanations of in-group bias in the minimal group paradigm, so remember overestimators, underestimators, are sufficient and are kind of the right strength to explain observed outcomes. I think it's a very interesting field of research. If you look out for recent papers, you can find quite a lot of them. So to wrap up, what should you bear in mind thinking about attitudes and behaviors? So because it's important to understand what an attitude is, just an enduring evaluation of an object. And think about the relationships and recognize that sometimes attitudes predict behaviors, but usually there are lots of other factors as well. So just studying attitudes if we're interested in behaviors is a mistake. Conversely, sometimes behaviors shape attitudes, and understanding that can really help with thinking about interventions about attitude change. And the theory of planned behavior highlights a third aspect that's quite important, which is around perceived control. If you don't think you can engage in the behavior that you like, it's unlikely that you will even try. And the final point here is the point I just made with reference to Schelling's work, that quite often the links between attitudes and aggregate behaviors at a society level are difficult to draw. So that's something where you really need to engage in critical thinking. And sometimes I encourage you to look for papers that actually model what their explanations for attitude behavior links would look like in a population of triangles and squares, which of course isn't realistic, but it can still be very instructive. How's this related to previous sections? Clearly there's a link between attitudes and social cognition. we need to see a certain situation as requiring moral action in order to apply our morality to that situation. And one explanation for Milgram's experiments, for example, is that a laboratory is such a special setting that people might just not construct it as a situation where their moral beliefs have a role to play. Of course, it directly relates to conformity and compliance. I might have private attitudes that make a certain behavior appear very negative, and I might still conform to a group because of social pressure and all the other reasons for conformity. I might engage in lots of motivated reasoning to make attitudes and behaviors fit, even if most observers say there seems to be a discrepancy here. And at the same time, this desire for beliefs to fit together, the desire to avoid cognitive dissonance, might explain attitude changes. And finally, this is of course linked to the earlier parts of today's lecture, where I'd encourage you to really think about how attitudes are defined and measured, whether certain measurements from a laboratory setting can tell us much about the real world. But that's also something that comes with practice from reading lots and lots of articles over the time of your studies and really thinking about whether those interpretations about relationships between attitudes and behaviors are convincing. So, as always, this is a good moment to maybe have a look back at the slides, note down any questions, and I'm looking forward to discussing some of this further with you in class. So, see you there.